Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at Arizona Foundation for Women for one of our She Talks, which is something that we very much look forward to because it's our way of giving back to the community in a small way by educating and giving information on topics that are helpful. And the topic today is something that you don't hear very much about, but it is so very important, and that is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls here in Arizona. It's not a very fun topic, but it is so important, like I said, that we get the word out there because together, Arizona Foundation for Women and you can make a difference in getting this to stop and helping those women and girls that are stuck in this situation. So, a couple housekeeping things I want to tell you about. If you have any questions, you should see at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A box. Did I get that right, Megan? A Q&A box where you can type in a question. We will have a question and answer session after our distinguished speakers speak. And we have some questions already, but if there's something you're just dying to ask, go ahead and put it in there and we'll see if we can work it in. Now, Arizona Foundation for Women is an incredible nonprofit here in Arizona that strives to make things as good and as best and as amazing as possible for women here in our state through a variety of programs. If you want to learn more about AFW, our programs, how you can help, maybe even becoming a member of Arizona Foundation for Women, then go ahead and go over to the right side of the screen and you'll be able to see how you can become part of it. So I want to go ahead and throw it over to Maureen Busaletti. She is the Vice Chair of Arizona Foundation for Women and soon to be our wonderful chair. So, Maureen?
Thank you so much, Monica. I want to welcome and thank you for joining our She Talk today on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We are so grateful to our speakers for bringing this important issue to the forefront and educating us on how, as Arizonans, we can do our part to support and protect tribal women. As Monica said, She Talks is a series of events that we hold to raise awareness on issues affecting women in Arizona, and we are so pleased to be able to continue these events virtually. The mission of Arizona Foundation for Women is about advancing the status of Arizona's women through research, advocacy, and philanthropy to ensure their safety, health, and economic independence. We have a tagline that we like to share with people to help them remember who we are and what we do. So we say we wrap research, advocacy, and philanthropy to SHE, safety, health, and economic empowerment. I want to thank our event partner, ASU's School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And I also want to thank our event sponsors, Kefi Catalyst and Rosendin. Their logos and a link to their website appear on your screen. At the Arizona Foundation for Women, we often hear from people on a daily basis, both men and women, about how they can become more involved and support our organization, and there are many ways. You can become a member of AFW for as little as $10 a month, connecting your giving power with like-minded Arizonans who are leading the fight so that every woman in Arizona can change what's possible for her community, and future generations. We also have a She Partners program where we collaborate with women corporations across the state. If your company has a women's affinity group and would be interested in speaking with us, we'd love to discuss engagement opportunities. And for more information on all of the ways that you can get more involved, please see our website by clicking on the logo on your screen. We'll also provide additional information via email following today's event. And now I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our three guest speakers. Our first speaker is Debbie Nez-Manuel. Ms. Nez-Manuel is a longtime community leader, activist, and advocate for people of color in urban, rural, and remote communities across Arizona. She grew up on the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona and has lived in Phoenix for 3 decades. With a successful career with Casey Family Programs in partnership with the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. Ms. Nez-Manuel has a great understanding of the complexities surrounding the victimization of Native American women and girls, and was instrumental in the unanimous passage of House Bill 2570 in the Arizona Senate and House. This monumental legislation established a 21-member study on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And the bill was the first of its kind in the nation, and I'm happy to report that other states are following suit. The election of Miss Nez-Manuel in January of 2020 was a historic milestone as well for the Arizona Democratic Party, as she became its first Indigenous National Committee person. I'm also pleased to say that Debbie was also a previous board member for AFW. Our next guest speaker is Representative Jennifer Jermaine. Representative Jermaine is a state representative from Legislative District 18, representing Tempe, Mesa, Chandler, and Ahwatukee. And she serves as chairwoman for the statewide task force investigating missing and murdered Indigenous people, and sits on the Government and Elections Committee and the Public Safety, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. She has spent the last 18 years in the nonprofit industry and is currently the executive director of We the People Summit, which empowers individuals to strategize and collaborate to influence public policy. And our third speaker is Dr. Kate Fox. Dr. Fox is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at ASU and director of the Research on Violent Victimization Laboratory. She earned a PhD in criminology, law, and society from the University of Florida. Her research focuses primarily on crime victimization, particularly on underserved populations, including American women and Indian women and girls, migrant women and girls, and incarcerated offenders. She's also an active partner with Arizona's legislators on legislation supporting missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Ms. Nez-Manuel, Representative Jermaine, and Dr. Fox. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Nez-Manuel to kick off our discussion.
Good afternoon, ladies, and everyone that's joining this presentation. Thank you to Arizona Foundation for Women for hosting this very important conversation. I am right now in a parked vehicle in front of McDonald's. These are some of the issues that tribal communities face, is access to broadband. And so I had returned up to Navajo Nation for some very important activities and family events. So I'm just on my way back, but I wanted to make sure to be here to help answer questions and share information. I just shared with you my kinship, who I'm related to, where I come from, who my maternal and paternal grandparents are. Something that's very important within our traditional community settings is just to acknowledge, because we never know, there's always a Navajo in the audience. So based on the number of people we have today, I can probably guess that there's a Navajo somewhere in there. But I just want to say thank you. What brings me here today is a very difficult situation or a set of circumstances that I went through as a child. At the age of 3 in 1974, my mother had left on foot to go find my father. And in this short time of looking for my father, she never returned home. And as time had passed, I probably didn't really find out the story until I was close to 30. It's taken so many years to put the story together, because for a lot of different reasons. One is, within our culture and tradition, we're told not to talk about those who have passed, or to bring up events like this that would cause more spiritual disconnect or harm to who we are, or probably to our mental health. But, you know, when you lose your mother, you have no choice but to ask those questions. What happened, you know, to her then? Where am I at today? And what are the events that took place between then and now? And it was these circumstances that I decided to bring forward when I got to know House Rep Jennifer Jermaine. She had been elected, and she was telling me that there were bills that were there and she would work on them. And I said, well, whatever you need help with, you know, if there's anything I can do to help, I have some time. I had met her on the lawn at the downtown and at the Capitol, and I returned a few days later to find out that she had a bill, and she said this is going to be for the missing and murdered Indigenous women study group. And
Debbie, we can't hear you yet. This is the wonderful world of technology.
Okay, I'm going to try to help you.
Okay, we can hear you, Debbie.
Okay, my phone is getting warm. That might be the case. But just wanted you all to know that it was that story, my mother's story, that helped to open the doors for this legislation to take place. And so at this time, we came across so many opportunities to tell that story. And I feel like my mother was the one who led this charge. And I think that's really important to know at this time, is that we have to continue to work to find these women. I just want to test the sound. Are you still there? Hello?
Okay. Did we lose Debbie again?
Are you there?
Okay, Debbie, we can hear you.
Okay. So it's this time that we were able to take my mom's story and help elevate the priority of the conversation and from there we were able to mobilize them.
If you can hear me, let's go ahead and take a time out. Let's go ahead and go over to Representative Jennifer Jermaine, and let's have her go ahead and talk to us while Debbie is able to maybe let her phone cool off a little bit. All right, Representative.
Thank you so much, Monica. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm State Representative Jennifer Jermaine from Legislative District 18. That is the cities of Tempe, Mesa, Chandler, and Ahwatukee. My family is White Earth Ojibwe. I am a third-generation urban native. My grandfather took the relocation money in 1956 and moved our family off the reservation and into the urban setting. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how our Arizona approach is different from that of other states. So the legislature's approach, we took one of a social work perspective. So our study on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is led and directed by Indigenous women and those who are already working with survivors and family members within our Indigenous communities. And it was so very important for us to make sure that this effort was being led by the people who were directly affected by this crisis. And we took a different approach from other states. Other states looked at this as a purely law enforcement problem, whereas we really wanted to make sure that we were centering the victim and looking at the holistic impacts on families and on tribal clans and on the larger tribal communities when women and girls went missing. So our committee goals were to partner with tribal and urban Indigenous communities. And we were also pretty unique that we were bringing in our large urban Indian centers into our study committee. We wanted to make sure we were blending both Indigenous communities because they have different challenges. But we wanted to make sure that we were bringing everybody in and that we were approaching this subject in a culturally competent way that would not cause further harm to survivors and family members or infringe upon tribal sovereignty. We wanted to work with law enforcement, social work agencies, tribes, nonprofit advocacy groups to uncover a more accurate understanding of the problem and begin to quantify the data. We made recommendations to state, local, county, and tribal law enforcement agencies on how to standardize data and some training for law enforcement personnel and victim advocates. And standardization of the data allows us to see patterns within the crime data, which in turn tells us as a state where we need to target those financial resources to really make an impact in lessening this crisis. We wanted to ensure families had a right to anonymize their data in any published reports. And I'm very proud of how we have been able to protect the privacy and the secrecy of these families. And we wanted to use this data to drive legislation at all levels to help solve the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. In the next section of this talk, Dr. Kate Fox will talk about some of the research that came out of the study committee, but I wanted to go over with you a few pieces of legislation that are still moving in our state legislature that came out of the study committee. The first bill that we have that is still moving, we found a big problem here in Arizona where there was not consistent reporting of missing children up to the national databases. And whether that's the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or the NCIC FBI database. So we wanted to make sure that every child who goes missing gets placed within those databases. The problem with only reporting to the Arizona databases is that our tribes do not have access to those databases, and law enforcement from other states and across the border do not have access to those databases. That's why it is so important for our Arizona law enforcement agencies to report up to these national databases. And I'm happy to report that the databases have the capability to do that. And it's looking like this is a coding problem. So we are moving with some tenacity with our law enforcement agencies to get some computer programmers in there to start fixing these problems and making these databases talk to each other. So this has already passed the House chamber and it's awaiting. I found out this morning that it has been assigned to the Senate Judiciary Committee. So we're hopefully going to be in the front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in the next 2 weeks. When we put through House Bill 2099 is an extension of the study committee for 2 additional years, and it also expands the scope to include all Indigenous people. So we did find a significant number of missing men and boys, and we wanted to go back and further examine that and interview those families. And this says it passed the House chamber. It was supposed to be up for a vote today, and that vote did not happen. So we're hopefully going to be past the House chamber on Monday. And that will probably also go to the Senate Judiciary Committee. We found that the crisis is exacerbated by the lack of healthcare workers in our tribal nations and rural communities. So Senator TJ Shope from District 8, which encompasses most of the Gila River Indian community, he and I ran identical bills to create a workforce training program for the Indian health services and native health systems here within Arizona. It's a program run through the University of Arizona College of Medicine And we are hoping that this will land on the governor's desk within the next 2 weeks. This will really help to bring up our nurses, our doctors, our social workers, our victim services specialists within these rural tribal communities. And the final bill that we still have moving, we are expanding the Arizona Police Standards and Training Board, AZ Post, to include somebody who is a member of a tribal nation. One of the big problems that we found with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is that we have a lot of missing people in our urban communities, and our law enforcement agencies knew absolutely nothing about it. And they did not have the cultural training to interact with these families and to help ensure that remains were processed properly and within the proper cultural standards and returned to their tribes within a timely manner. So this is also important because most Bureau of Indian Affairs or Section 638 self-determined law enforcement agencies, and these are federal classifications, those law enforcement officers are cross-certified with the Arizona Post standards. So this has passed the House chamber and it is waiting on committee assignment in the Senate. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Kate Fox to talk a little bit about the research that came out of the study committee.
Thank you so much, Representative Jermaine. I would like to begin by acknowledging that ASU sits on the ancestral homelands of those Indigenous nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. My name is Kate Fox, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University, and I'm also the director of the Research on Violent Victimization Lab. So the mission of our lab is to find solutions to complex problems, and we would like to call your attention today to the complex problem, as you know, of the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls. So let's dive right in and talk about what the research shows. Indigenous women and girls are murdered at a rate of 10 times the national average. This is more than any other racial or ethnic group. These numbers are shocking, but our research also revealed that statistics like this are undercounts because of inaccurate or non-existent data collection efforts. So the true extent and scope of MMIWG, or missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls, is actually not currently known. This crisis is not new. It has long-lasting consequences with severe cultural impacts. Many Indigenous communities are matriarchal, and women and girls are considered to be sacred with the power of giving life during childbirth. So the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls has devastating consequences that impact generations of Indigenous peoples and communities. And in this era of addressing structural racism and systemic injustice, the opportunity to address this crisis should not be ignored. And in fact, the United States is now waking up to the realization that our Indigenous women and girls are at higher risk of becoming missing and murdered. And again, this is more than any other racial or ethnic group. Throughout this presentation, I'd like to read selected quotes from Indigenous community members that spoke during the public testimony portion of the legislative hearings. One person who testified illustrated the complexities faced by many communities. They said, "Our matriarchs in our communities are disempowered. They're the voices and the community builders in our community, yet they are oftentimes voiceless because the people that are expected to speak for the community are often the men. But remember, we are a matriarchal community in this tribe. So to empower these women means creating safer communities and enabling That safety means allowing them to speak. So in 2019, Arizona was the third state in the nation to implement legislation with the goal of reducing the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls. And our ASU research team partnered with the state of Arizona and the study committee chaired by Representative Jermaine. And the study committee was comprised of tribal legislators, community leaders, advocates, including Debbie Nez-Manuel, who chaired the data sharing subcommittee. And over the past 18 months, we partnered with the state and the study committee to investigate how often Indigenous women and girls go missing and are murdered, and to develop culturally accurate, culturally appropriate policy recommendations to end this crisis. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our core ASU team, who is diverse and highly trained on the cultural and historical oppression faced by Indigenous peoples. And importantly, as Representative Jermaine mentioned earlier, the majority of our team as well are Indigenous. And we also support several Indigenous students in our work and on this project. And in doing this research, our team learned one very important lesson, which was that the data on the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls is extremely limited. And in fact, the real prevalence of this crisis is certainly much higher than the data actually show. So what are those barriers to tracking violence against women and girls? There are so many systemic barriers to tracking MMIWG, or the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls. And just to name a few, there are unique barriers in urban and rural and remote areas, including long distances to travel, a lack of confidentiality, a lack of safe houses, a lack of trust of victim service providers, a lack of phone and broadband coverage, as Debbie Nez-Manuel was just mentioning earlier on our call. And also racial misclassification happens when law enforcement inadvertently designates or applies or specifies an incorrect race for Indigenous people, because police may not know the race of the person. And it's not always visibly obvious many times to ascribe an Indigenous race for some people. So that characterizes racial misclassification. Also, there's some distrust of law enforcement among some Indigenous communities, and this is only compounded by severe underfunding and understaffing. During the public testimony of one of our meetings, an Indigenous person said, "No one seeks answers in these murders. And if the authorities investigate, they don't share what they know, or nobody comes to tell us what they've discovered. Even if there's not a conclusion, there's no ongoing updates. At this time, I don't know if my granddaughter will ever come home. We are still waiting." This quote highlights the uncertainty that family members often experience when a loved one is missing, and the problems with some police investigation and communications. Next, let's talk about how often women and girls are missing and murdered in Arizona. We examined the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, which is called NamUs for short, and that data shows a snapshot of missing persons on any given day. And you can access this actually right now. So it's really interesting to see that it's open to the general public. And when we conducted this analysis, we found that 12 Indigenous females, adult females, and 34 Indigenous adult males were missing on the day that we investigated this. And this was interesting because it showed that Indigenous men also go missing, just as Representative Jermaine mentioned earlier. This is not just a problem that impacts women. And on this particular day, we pulled data from NamUs. The number of missing Indigenous people were 3 times more likely to be male than female. So what's also interesting is that the women were missing for about twice as long as the males. Imagine waiting for years to find one of your loved ones. So to put this into context, I'd like to read you another quote. Another Indigenous person testified at one of our public meetings that they said, "I've been doing this missing person search for 5.5 years to have my cousin's name out there. I'm not letting go. He's not home, and that hurts." And while some missing persons are found, either alive or deceased, many are missing indefinitely. So I'd like to turn now to the homicides of Indigenous women and girls. One of the most alarming findings from our study revealed that murders of Indigenous women and girls have been increasing in Arizona for the past 40 years. And with the impacts of COVID-19 and the complexities surrounded by the stay-at-home orders due to the pandemic on reservations, and domestic and family violence potentially increasing in some locations, we fully expect these rates to continue to increase in the coming years. One person who testified at a public hearing said, "There's a lot of people that are missing here that people don't talk about." And some families and communities are more open to talking about the missing of a loved one, and others are not. In fact, in some Indigenous communities, as was mentioned earlier, the tradition and culture make it taboo to speak someone's name after they've died. And this sometimes impacts whether or not a missing or a murdered person situation is reported. So there have been cultural shifts happening across generational lines, and communities are beginning to talk about this. And we've seen this over and over with the public hearings that we've held. Representative Jermaine and the study committee have worked with tribal councils to ensure that communities are being respected and listened to. So now let's turn to some of our other findings from the statewide study. Of the reported homicides, we found that Indigenous women and girls are killed throughout the state of Arizona, with hot spots showing higher rates in more of the urban areas. But again, keep in mind that the known cases of homicides that occur, these are of known cases, rather, homicides. So those that occur on tribal land or in more remote areas may be a lot harder to document. So they might not be captured in these data. Using the FBI's data for the past 40 years, we also found that Indigenous females of all ages were killed, ranging from infant all the way to elder. So in other words, no one is immune to this crisis. And even so, women in their 20s and 30s were at the highest risk of being murdered. About 1/3 of the victim-offender relationships we found to be unknown, which just further emphasizes that a lot remains unknown with MMIWG, or missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls. And another almost 1/3 of homicides were between intimate partners. Also, the circumstances surrounding MMIWG are largely unknown too, not surprisingly, given the state of the knowledge on this. So whereas over half of the homicides had no documentation as to the causes or correlates of how the homicide happened or why. So there was a substantial number of homicides that resulted from arguments, with about 50% of homicides having to do with some kind of dispute. And then keep in mind too that the homicides can have multiple contributing factors, so the percentages here don't necessarily add up to 100%. So in conclusion, I'd like to emphasize two things. The first is the magnitude of this problem. And this is succinctly illustrated here by this quote by an Indigenous person who testified at one of the hearings. They said, "You don't heal if you don't have an answer." And this really speaks to the gravity of the long-term implications of having a family member who suddenly vanishes or is killed. The last point I'd like to emphasize is that it is possible to reduce the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls. This is solvable. But the solutions have to be in close partnership with tribal nations to ensure that sovereignty and culture and values and political integrity of tribal governments are respected. And as you can imagine, that is a long-term commitment and one that Representative Jermaine and the study committee have embarked upon to really improve the lives and the safety of women in Arizona. So thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to speak with you today, and certainly an honor and a privilege to work with Representative Jermaine and Ms. Debbie Nez-Manuel. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kate, very much for that information. A quick question for you, Kate. This came from our viewers, and I think it's right up your alley. You talked about how there were 34 adult males that were missing or murdered. And you said on any one day these stats could change, and that men were 3 times more likely to be male than women, but women are missing longer. A question was, can you provide stats on how many children and women are being trafficked in Arizona? I know that we're talking about missing and murdered. Does the trafficking go in with that as well, or is that a different area that's being researched?
It's a really good question, and one that I'm unable to answer, quite frankly. So yes, we do know without a doubt that human trafficking, sex trafficking is related to the missing and murder of Indigenous women and girls, without a doubt. But in terms of the data that are out there to support that, I don't have that. And the data that we looked at, the Federal Bureau of Investigations data, did not provide that as well.
Do you think that there's a reason why there are more men than there are women? And is that, do you think, reality, or do you think that's just a consequence of who's actually reporting the information?
That's a really good question, and one that I have to remind that can change on a daily basis. So NamUs really provides a really nice snapshot of, on a daily basis, who is missing at that time. But what it doesn't give us is, it doesn't give us this nice trend to see if that's even a pattern or something that just happened on that one particular day. So while I presented data in terms of the missing persons on one day, I presented data on homicides for 40 years. So we can trust those as more of a long-term pattern. But in terms of the missing persons being overwhelmingly male, I don't think we're ready to make that. Using the data that I looked at, we're not ready to make that commitment or statement.
Yeah.
You know,
if I can chime in on this as well.
Please.
In Arizona, it is not a crime to be missing if you're an adult. So most of these cases do not make it into these databases in the first place because it is not a crime for an adult to go missing.
You know, following up on that, one of the questions that we had, Jennifer, was that how come these types of cases don't ever make it into the media? We never hear stories on TV or on the radio or in print about any of these murdered or missing Indigenous women and girls. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think part of it goes back to the traditional cultural taboo of speaking about somebody when they are not around or when they've already passed away. But also part of it goes back to just historic patterns within our media where they do not pay attention to minority communities, and especially communities who don't tend to live in big urban centers. So when we're looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the one media outlet who has been covering this crisis for years is Indian Country Today, which is based at ASU Cronkite.
Okay.
And I really do want to commend the students at Cronkite News, because they have been following us and doing really amazing reporting for the last 3 years, and really elevating this crisis. And some of it has been picked up by national news outlets. Some of it has been picked up by CNN. Some of it has been picked up by PBS NewsHour. And these are student-produced segments that really highlight the work that is going on here in our local communities.
You know, I've heard such wonderful things about Cronkite, and I've had the pleasure of interacting with a lot of students from there in the media or in events like this. And I think you're right that they are working hard to make some changes. And in fact, we received a question from a journalism grad student over at ASU's Cronkite School, and she wants to know, I'm sorry, it could be a boy, but they want to know, what can journalists do to get involved in solving this problem? And the second part is, what do you think past news coverage on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls has done right and wrong? And you mentioned what they've done wrong is they just haven't covered it. The information's not getting out. So again, what can a journalism student do? And then is there anything that the media is doing right in this regard?
Yeah. I absolutely love working with our journalism students, and really we saw this become a national news story in late 2018 with the publication of the Urban Indian Health Institute's report, and that's Abigail Echohart, who is a phenomenal Indigenous researcher and public health expert and epidemiologist, and really highlighting the fact that these cases simply have disappeared entirely from databases. They've disappeared entirely from media. It's been this silent epidemic for centuries within indigenous communities. This is not a new problem, but really having that report come out in late 2018, and then the Canadian government's report come out in January of 2019. Really laid the groundwork for us doing our work in January of 2019 to push this to the forefront of the Arizona legislature. And then that also coinciding with Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids being the first ever Indigenous women elected to Congress, and then them making this an issue at the national congressional level really helped to elevate it within the media. And now it's our job as people who have platforms, as journalists, as community advocates, to make sure it doesn't disappear within the 24/7 news cycle. Make sure we keep highlighting what is happening and the injustices that are happening within our communities. And I know we had talked a little bit about how it has generational impacts. For my family, this happened 4 generations ago, and it took my grandfather 70 years to find his father's body. And we were lucky. We were a lucky family that we at least had answers and had a body to bury. And that's not something that happens to most families.
You know, being in media, I've been lucky enough to be part of that world a little bit. And what I've noticed is it's not always the big stories of the day that get the attention. Obviously, those get the attention. But I have seen young reporters and journalists come with ideas to their bosses and saying, hey, what about a series on this? Or what about a story on this? And I think maybe with what you said about Cronkite and these students, maybe they can keep that in their mind when they go on from college and go into the big world of media and enlighten their bosses on these kind of issues that are out there.
Yes, and the tribes are starting to really want to talk about this, and it just really takes reaching out to the community relations office for each tribe and setting up an appointment and getting permission to speak with their people.
Now, one of the questions was, what efforts can or are being made to encourage cooperation from tribal law enforcement? Now, you talked about how it can be taboo, or it is taboo to speak of somebody if they have died or if people believe that they're dead. Does that hinder tribal law enforcement from going out there and spreading the information, or maybe getting cooperation from other groups?
Yeah, so one of the big challenges is that our the Bureau of Indian Affairs, their law enforcement departments are vastly understaffed.
Oh.
And when you look at pay comparisons, they're vastly underpaid in comparison to an Arizona DPS trooper or to a county sheriff's officer.
Okay.
And when we're looking at cooperation and collaboration across jurisdictional lines, sometimes those lines are very complex. Some of our tribal reservations are checkerboarded. So you can have one corner that is tribal jurisdiction and one corner that is county island jurisdiction. But we are making strides. We are working with the Indian Country Justice Network, which is headed up by the Chief Arbok from the Salt River Puna Maricopa Indian community that is right alongside Scottsdale and Tempe here in Maricopa County. And we are working very, very closely with Attorney General Mark Brnovich. And he has already started tribal consultations with many of our tribes to start developing some of these training programs around cultural sensitivities and the complexity of the jurisdictional issues. So things are moving along. We are opening up communication lines and getting people talking, and that will hopefully, we've got some great examples of how this can work amazingly well. The East Valley Crisis Response Team is a collaboration of the City of Scottsdale, City of Chandler, City of Tempe, the Gila River Indian Community, Mesa, City of Mesa, and the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. And they have a rapid response team that collaborates with all of those law enforcement agencies on these cases. And they are pretty good at solving them really quickly.
Good.
We have a great model that is being piloted here in the East Valley, and we want to take that statewide.
Yes. And then maybe even nationwide after that, right? So that we can get the word out. It sounds like a lot of this, it's communication and education. Education about what is really going on, and education how to deal with it and how to communicate with the tribe, or the tribes, I should say, and other law enforcement agencies. Did I sum that up right?
Yeah. And then there are other complexities that lay on top of it. We need Congress to renew the Violence Against Women Act. A lot of prosecution of these crimes, their prosecutorial rights within the tribes lie within the Violence Against Women Act. So with that being lapsed, we're kind of in a jurisdictional nowhere land as far as who can prosecute these crimes. So having those clear-cut lines of prosecution would really help. And we're also working really closely with Pasquayaki Attorney General Alfred Urbina and with our congressional delegation to see if we can get those through the federal government.
Tell us a little bit about what exactly is the Violence Against Women Act, and why did it lapse, if you know?
Yeah, the Violence Against Women Act was a federal piece of legislation that passed 12 years ago, I believe it was, and that contained within it a bunch of programs targeting domestic violence and targeting a couple other programs. It had a lot of funding in it for domestic violence shelters. It had a lot of funding in it for community programs. But buried within that was also the right for tribes to prosecute non-Native offenders in sexual violence cases. So we really do need to have that act renewed so that tribes have the legal capacity to prosecute these crimes when the offender is not a Native person.
So that's something that needs to be done. And it sounds like that maybe that's something that those watching this or who will be able to watch this She Talks later, is that something they can help with? Can they write to people, write to their representatives? Can they send letters or emails? Or how can they get involved with not only helping with this incredibly sad but important issue, but also dealing with helping getting that act back up?
Yeah, definitely. I would say people can email their congressional representative or Senator Kyrsten Sinema or Senator Mark Kelly and just ask them to renew the Violence Against Women Act. It's vitally important for our tribal communities.
Yeah, that very much. And what we're going to do is when we upload the She Talks for people to look at, and in our emails that we send out following up on this, we will have some links that people can click on that will take them over to Kyrsten Sinema's website, Mark Kelly's website, and then also some addresses if people would like to send letters to. And perhaps with your help, Representative, we can put some more information so people can learn how to help. Now, what I listened to earlier was that Arizona was the third state in the nation that passed legislation in this area. What is going on now, or what are you pushing for now in your capacity or in your position to help in this area here in Arizona?
Yeah, so we are pushing through some of the legislation that came out of our initial study, and then we're also pushing to expand and extend our study so that we can look deeper into these issues. One of the big problems that we found is that some of our large law enforcement agencies were not properly racially classifying people within their databases, and some didn't even have a checkbox for Native American. So we wanted to make sure, and we got a lot of that done administratively, that we are properly tracking data so that we can see the trends within the data over time and be able to see what is happening where and where we need to target resources. We really want to be smart with how we are using the limited resources that the state does have.
Right. It sounds like this is quite a fight to be had. And even though it's been going on for a long time, we need to step up and fight harder to get the resources that we need to help with in this area. One of the great questions we have from a younger person was, what kinds of jobs or professions are available in this area that they can focus on to get involved? We heard Dr. Kate Fox talk about the research. We know that you're a representative and that's one position you can have. What are some others out there that you've come across that people might want to look into?
Oh, goodness. If people want to become nurses, we've got a severe shortage in nurses and an even more severe shortage in nurses who are trained in forensic sexual assault kits.
Okay.
We've got a severe shortage in social workers. We've got a severe shortage in victim advocates and legal advocates, people who know how to help families navigate through the legal process. That was one of the big findings from our study, was that a lot of these families were never referred to a victim advocate because there wasn't one available in their community.
Okay.
And if you've ever tried to deal with the legal system on your own, it's very complex. And if you're in trauma and in a crisis, it's even more complex.
Now, are there positions available in the tribe or on tribal lands, or do you have to be someone that's in the tribe to be able to fulfill those positions and to help those families? So
I know that tribal prosecutor offices hire non-Native people all the time.
Okay.
They do a lot of cultural training to make sure that people understand what the complexities of the communities are. But it is not limited to only people from that tribe.
Okay, I know that that's a question that may seem so basic, but I know there's a lot of people out there that would have that question because they want to get involved and maybe they're just not sure if they can. Now we know they can and how they can get involved. So we're about ready to wrap up this incredible hour that has been full of such important information. Representative Jennifer Jermaine, let me ask you, if there was one thing that our audience could take away from everything that you've told us in this time you spent with us today, what would you want them to take away?
Oh, goodness.
I know that's a tall question.
It's a tall question. I would say to remember that this is happening and it's happening right under our noses and in the shadows. And it's our job to stand up and to highlight what is happening and try to figure out and solve these problems. Like Dr. Fox said, this is a solvable crisis. We just need to figure out what resources to put where, right, and how to properly collect the data so that we can see what is going on.
Well, our state of Arizona is so fortunate to have you working on this and helping educate our community on what's going on and letting people know how they can get involved because it's so important. Is Dr. Kate Fox still on? Dr. Fox, same question to you. With all the information that you all have shared with us in this hour, what is the one thing that you wish that people would take away from this discussion today and not forget?
Mm-hmm. Well, I echo Representative Jermaine's articulate answer to that question. I would also support that with encouraging people to support the movement on MMIWG. May 5th is the national day to remember and recognize MMIWG. So look for events that are happening nationwide, but also within our state to honor and recognize on May 5th. Learn more about MMIWG. You can type in your social media, hashtag MMIW or MMIWG, and learn a lot more about it. Participating in events like the May 5th event or other events in the state, and donating to programs that address this crisis would be a takeaway message I'd like to share.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies. Your time and the information you've shared with us is priceless. And we hope that this hour really helps people understand that this is an issue that really needs a lot of hard work. And together we can help, move the needle forward with getting some of these resources that are needed. But not only that, getting the word out, educating people about what's going on right underneath our noses that many people haven't heard about. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today, Arizona Foundation for Women's She Talks series. Today we talked about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls here in Arizona. And we've learned that it is a significant problem. And it's not only here in Arizona, but it's across the country. So thank you for your time. And please share this information. We will be following up with you all that registered with an email with some information about how you can get a hold of your representatives and our politicians and how you can support the efforts in the MMIWG fight. You just heard Dr. Fox talk about the hashtag and May 5th. We'll also put some information in our follow-up emails regarding that. So take action. Use the template that we're going to provide to you to go ahead and write to those Congress people and the representatives and those powers that be so that we can make a change. And Arizona Foundation for Women, that's what we try to do every day. And again, if you want to be part of our group, look to the right of your screen or visit our website, azfw.org, and see how you can become involved. So thank you so much for attending today, and we hope you all have a great night.